Good evening. My name is Robert Stokes, and I would like to talk to you today about mental illness called PTSD. I'm a 21-year vet on the City of Detroit Fire Department, as well as a senior training officer. And I have an opportunity to watch some of our new, inspiring young cadets fulfill the shoes of some of their forefathers as they become firefighters. I watch how when they come through the academy, with a look of anticipation, excitement, and vigor on becoming a firefighter. But I also understand that after 21 years on the job, there's another side of that coin that is very often not talked about, and that is the mental illness of PTSD. Since I've been on this job, I realized over my 21 years, all the traumatic experiences and events and incidences that I've responded to have oftentimes made me have to think about some of my previous colleagues. And it allows me to sometimes wonder how this mental illness has gone undiagnosed and how it has not offered those who suffer from it any type of assistance. PTSD is a mental illness that has been well documented back since 1900 BC to present day. The mental illness PTSD started in World War I, which deals with shell shock, the shell shock syndrome. Now, although it didn't have a lot of documentation behind it, it was truly identified as a potential diagnosis in the military. When World War II came around, the diagnosis became clear and more defined. And with the Korean War and the Vietnam War, a lot of medical professionals really documented some of the behaviors, the psychological effects that many of the combat soldiers were suffering from those wars back in World War II as well. And at that point in time, you really had assistance being offered to that mental illness of PTSD to military combat vets. Now, much like the fire service, we too also become exposed to many traumatic events and experiences over a lifetime career service. And oftentimes, the majority of those individuals do not seek any type of medical attention or assistance. It becomes a constant bombardment of incident after incident. So much so that I pay very close attention to some things that have affected our department within the last 20 years. In 1999, one of my friends and esteemed colleagues committed suicide. Some of the signs and symptoms were attributing that call out for help, where he became more involved with gambling and drinking. But unlike me, and unlike some of my other colleagues, we did not recognize those signs and symptoms. In 1999, a very good friend of mine who was a lieutenant on the Detroit Fire Department named Kenny Davis committed suicide at the casino. And he too also ended up with indulging in drinking and having an addiction to gambling as well. 2005, one of my classmates from high school, for which he and I actually joined the department and graduated out of the same cadet class, he also committed suicide due to the fact that his previous employment with the city as a firefighter and him running into a traumatic event where there was the death of 6 children caused for him to be placed on a duty. And even though he underwent treatment, he never recovered from that one-time traumatic event. And then there was a suicide committed by one of our captains this year. His name was Mark Knowles. And he was also someone that I've actually had the opportunity to work with day in and day out as well. And what I've understood was that this mental illness, PTSD, is not a phenomenon. It is a realistic mental illness problem that is definitely plaguing fire departments across the country, as well as society as a whole. But for sure, it has definitely impacted our fire department as well. When I look at the statistical data, with 1 out of 4 Americans across this country in North America suffering from this mental illness, that equates to over 31,049 individuals a year being diagnosed and impacted with this mental illness. That turns out to be basically at least 89 people a day that have completed suicide. Not just the suicidal attempts, but actually went through and completed committing suicide. It makes the attention have to focus on why is it that this is becoming such a big problem in our society, as well as in the fire service. When I think about all of the departments and all the stories that can support the true mental illness of PTSD, signs and symptoms are loud and clear, but oftentimes we are just not prepared to recognize them. Some of the signs and symptoms that you will see is that willingness to want to quit, that depression mode where they withdraw and don't want to be bothered with anybody, where they're actually drinking more excessively than normal, or better yet, even the drug addiction is kicked in, just trying to cope with some of the traumatic incidences that they've encountered. This impact is even stemmed over into family homes, to where you can see the divorce rates are starting to creep up in the fire service as well as society as a whole. There needs to be some attention, and it is gaining some attention, to this true mental illness of PTSD. When you look at how the impact of this mental illness in our society is changing and shaping things that are being done legislatively across this country, you have to realize that there has to be some kind of attention brought to this true mental illness. Unfortunately, in the fire service, there is just not enough documentation to sustain this one mental illness directly impacting the fire service. But what you are noticing is that there's a lot of written material from different magazines, departments across the country that are paying a lot more attention to the signs and symptoms that are occurring in their departments. And hopefully, from pooling all this information together, just maybe, we can get this opportunity to where people understand the true seriousness of how the fire service, how society as a whole is being impacted by this mental illness disease called PTSD. Thank you and have a good evening.